Man,
That was a good segue for this parsha.
It is. So, here we are, Parshat Bo, and we're looking at Exodus chapters 10 through 13. I'm going to give us a little overview to refresh everybody's minds. If anybody read earlier in the week and it's getting a little milky headed, since we all had a nice weekend, I'm sure. And the emphasis that I felt to bring this week when I read it was this contrast of the plagues, which are power. They're like the raw exercise of power to the point of decimating. Literally, the word decimate comes from to kill 1 in 10. It's not literal, but I don't know, maybe the ratio, that's I'm theorizing, that the firstborn of every household, from the Pharaoh to the slaves in the dungeons, lost their firstborn. And so in contrast to that, though, there's this constant drumbeat of educating the children of Israel. And that I think that actually is a very powerful transition, that education and teaching the young is actually the most important exercise of power. And I think that this Parsha reading kind of trains a cautious reader in that way of thinking. So the central need to teach children is my subtitle. And let's get into it. So today I made our housekeeping slide. I don't know if we have any new people on today. I didn't see any. Let me take a quick peek. Looks like everyone is familiar with eNoam. So I won't go through the details housekeeping slide, but I will brag about my little housekeeping photo here. It's a Jewish family doing their long-term housekeeping by holding a Seder and teaching the children. So I'm sticking with my theme and playing with the literal interpretation of the term housekeeping. Keep your house. It's important. Train your kids. All right, so let's go through the summary. And I'm going to try to kind of draw attention to some of the details that I think emphasize the focus that I wanted to just bring some attention to today before we get to the questions and break out into our breakout rooms. So from the beginning of the Parsha, Moshe is told to come to Pharaoh. And the Parsha is called Bo, which in Hebrew means come. And it's interesting that it doesn't say go to Pharaoh. It says come to Pharaoh, which is actually an interesting distinction because in other places, Moshe is told to go to Pharaoh. But not in this Parsha reading. It's an interesting thing to theorize on. There's midrash on it. Rabbis have talked about this in the past. Little detail. To warn him of the coming plague of locusts. And so the plague of locusts is the 8th of the 10 plagues. So this reading will have the last 3 of the 10 plagues. And it begins with the locusts. And Pharaoh's servants say to Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go. And they have a very interesting quote there where they say to Pharaoh, I mean, it sounds a little direct when they say, don't you know, or knowest thou, if we're speaking in, King James English, knowest thou not that Mitzrayim is destroyed? Just an interesting thing for subjugates to say to the supreme leader, but I think they were getting pretty desperate. Pharaoh agrees to let only the men go, and he excludes the children very specifically. It's just, to me, there's another hint in that in this reading, the children were forbidden to go into worship with their parents. The locusts came, ate everything, including the fruits of the trees. And fruits of the trees might remind you of fruitfulness, offspring, reproduction, children. I thought that was a little detail that stood out to me in this list of how the locusts ate everything that was left behind from the hail, including the remaining fruit, the fruits of the trees. Pharaoh's heart was hardened again after the locusts were driven away by a strong wind. Then the Lord instructed Moshe to stretch out his hand towards heaven that there might be darkness. And then a paralyzing 3 days of darkness descended on Mitzrayim, so thick that people in the same room couldn't see each other. But it specifies that the children of Israel had light in their dwellings, which is interesting to see that Israel somehow was spared from the worst aspect of the plague. And there's something to read into that, I'm sure. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart again, and he refused to let Israel go. And then the Lord instructed Moshe to lead the people in preparing for the final plague, which was the death of all firstborn of man and beast in Mitzrayim. Then the Lord instructed Moshe and Israel to establish the Passover feast, which is the 7 days of unleavened bread and a Passover lamb, and using the blood of the Passover lamb on the doorpost of the home to signify that the house should be passed over by the destroyer when he came at midnight. And then also the command to instruct the children about the Passover story, about the flight from Egypt. Israel did as Moshe instructed, and the Lord came at midnight and smote all the firstborn of Mitzrayim, from the children of Pharaoh to the lowly prisoner in the dungeon. And in response to the shock of this, finally, Pharaoh and Mitzrayim united to actually push Israel to leave. And so thus was fulfilled after 430 years. It says to the day in the Parshat reading that Israel left Egypt. And I'm ending my summary here, but there's a little bit more after the statement about the 430 years. It talks a little bit more about the Passover, and but I felt that it was a little bit repetitive, so I'm not going to go into that now. So the thing I want to start by highlighting is that in the very beginning of our parsha, I'm going to look at these first two verses. And the Lord said to Moshe, "Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I might show thee my signs before him, and that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son and of thy son's son what things I have done in Mitzrayim." So right away, the beginning, we see the contrast of Moshe going to Pharaoh, and then that being an instruction for the children and the children's children. And that's what stood out to me. Our next, so that was Exodus 10. And then the very ending of the Parsha reading, which is Exodus 13, just to show you that they're like bookends, and there's, instructions in between about the children. But here again, it says, "And it shall be thy son, when thy sons ask thee in time to come, saying, What is this? That thou shalt say to him, By strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Mitzrayim, from the house of bondage." And it goes on to keep it, the verse 15 here continues to instruct what to say to the children. And so I think that that's an important thing to think about, is what do we teach the children generation to generation? What stories do we teach the children generation to generation? And in this, in the Parsha here, we're seeing that God was instructing Moshe to instruct Israel on how to instruct the children. And here I wanted to take a small moment to segue to show what I think is an expression of children who have been educated in a beautiful way. This location here is in Renana in Israel. And this very week, there was a terrible terrorist attack from an individual who stole multiple cars, and drove into people at this very location. And teenagers from a high school in the area were hit and were injured. And so the kids from the high school got together, came to the location of the attack, and this is what they did, and this is what they sang. Yeah. So derech aruka is the last word that it got cut off. So I actually put the words that they're singing right here at the top of my slide. So the English translation, my translation, I hope it's a good one, is "The eternal nation is not afraid of a long road." And that's what they're singing at the site of a terrible massacre, attack. So you can think that young people that are instructed well know how to face adversity, and they know how to face difficulty. And I think, hopefully, I believe this is a fulfillment of maybe some of the Torah instructions we're reading in the Parsha today. These kids have an identity, and they have a way to deal with the tragedy they were facing. And I just added my little footnote about Jeremiah 33, that, when I think of in response to these types of attacks, when people are trying to destroy Israel and to demotivate Jews from living in the land, because that's part of what terrorism is really about, that the Lord said in Jeremiah that, "For I will restore their fortunes and have compassion upon them." And if you read the passage around that in chapter 33, it also talks about Israel being a nation before the Lord forever. And so if you happen to believe in the Bible, that's pretty good news for Jews. So Next slide. I wanted to bring out another really interesting aspect of the paradigm that is maybe slightly hidden, is very hidden to English readers, but only very, very slightly hidden to Hebrew readers. And Yair, I have to give you credit because you brought this up on our Thursday meeting. So I will take no credit for having spotted this particular slide. And if you want to look with me at Exodus chapter 11, verse 1. And I'll read it in English just kind of to highlight kind of the interesting conflict between the Hebrew and the translation. So in English, and the Lord said to Moshe, "You will yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh, and upon Mitzrayim. Afterwards, he will let you go from there. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out altogether from here." And when you look at the Hebrew, there's some very interesting ideas here. And I mean, I'm not a qualified Hebrew teacher, so bear with me. This, if you look here, I highlighted in yellow the word kala. And in this case, the translators translated kala as altogether, which means completely or entirely. But kala also has a very interesting translation where it can also mean bride. It can also mean a bride of youth, and here a daughter-in-law as well, I guess. And that if you look at the word in front of it, shalcho, kala, garesh, yegaresh. Now, the word garesh also, if you look at my second little box here, has the meaning to put away or to divorce or to send away a woman. So here we have in the Hebrew, we have the word that can potentially be interpreted as wife, and we have basically shalcho also means to send. It means like a letter. You would send a letter. It's the same root, to send something. So to send this wife and to put her away, to thrust her away from you. So we have this image of Egypt sending out a wife away from itself. And I wanted to put forward to you that here we see a little bit of this paradigm in the Hebrew of Israel being a wife in preparation for the Lord. And of course, if you've read other passages in the prophetic writings, they talk about Israel being a bride for the Lord. And so it's already here in Exodus, and it's there to see. You can pick it up in the Hebrew. So kala, bride, it's there. All right.
No, but you have to also look at the verse following.
Okay. Oh, yes. Sorry. I completely forgot. I was going to make a nice point of that. What does a bride wear? Thank you, Yair. What does a bride wear? Well, speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man ask of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor jewels of silver and jewels of gold. So again, in the language, when you look at it all in context, you have this word that can mean bride. You have these verb roots like garesh that mean divorce or to send out a woman from your midst. And then you see, what does a bride wear? She wears silver and gold. And that's exactly what the next verse requests that Egypt give, the Mitzrayim give to Israel as they are going out into the wilderness to worship. So some food for thought there. Now, I also found another little Hebrew, tidbit that I found very interesting, that I just paused on it when I was reading it. If you're looking here, Exodus chapter 11, verse 7, and I'm going to read the whole verse 7 in English. But against any of the children of Israel, not a dog shall move its tongue, neither against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord differentiates between Mitzrayim and between Israel. And the word I want to focus on there is what was translated here as differentiates. And you could also translate this, the verb here in the Hebrew is yafle. And that can also be translated as to put a difference. But these are literal interpretations. And I wanted to break one of our little rules and bring in a psalm. And I know that the psalm isn't part of the Parshat reading, but if you'll permit me, it's really going to dovetail nicely into it. So if you look at Psalm 139, and in Psalm 139, it's sort of a description of this meditation on how God knows the writer intimately and formed the writer and created the author beautifully. And so if we look at verse, let's start on 13. I'll read it out. It's just so beautiful. Why not read it? For thou hast formed, and here translate reins. For thou hast formed my reins. Thou hast knit me together in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and my soul knows that right well. My frame was not hidden from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. So this section here that is translated in verse 14 as I am fearfully and wonderfully made uses the same verb root. This is the nif'al form of it for those who are Hebrew initiates, but so nifleti. And in the Parshat reading, the same verb is the one that's translated as differentiates. And what I want to draw out here is this idea that Israel leaving Egypt is not just a cold differentiation between good and evil. There is a contrast of good and evil. But here we see actually that I want to propose to you that hidden in the wording here is that God, the creator of heaven and earth, is actually doing a wondrous work where he's fearfully and wonderfully weaving together a new people, and he's doing it as he's differentiating them, as he's bringing them out of Egypt. And so there's a positive aspect to this, and I feel that that's reinforced by one of the laws in Deuteronomy 23, when the Lord said, "Thou shalt not abhor an Edomite, for he is thy brother. Thou shalt not abhor a Mitzrian, one who is from Mitzrayim, because thou wast a stranger in his land." There's a command there to not look back at Mitzrayim as this wicked foe that you need to hate. There's something else that's going on here. And I just wanted to highlight that in the reading, that we can see that God is doing a beautiful thing by birthing this release of Israel from Egypt. Okay. Now, another little point I want to draw in, and this gets back into the instructions of the Israelites, like how to instruct the Israelites, how to instruct the sons and to raise them up. And we'll go to Exodus chapter 13, verse 9. And this is where the tradition of the tefillin. So these soldiers in the picture here are wearing tefillin and they're praying. And they have a box on their left arm. Is that their left arm? Is this flipped? It's probably, is it the right arm or the left arm? Yeah,
it's the left.
It's the left. Okay. So there's the box on the left arm and a box on the forehead. And in those boxes, there are 4 compartments, and there are scriptures that are rolled up and put into those compartments. And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but in the among the Dead Sea Scrolls, in that find, they found tefillin. They found ancient Israelite tefillin in among the scrolls. And so we know this is a very ancient tradition. And even Jesus mentions tefillin in one of his passages when he's encouraging the Jews he was teaching to be truly spiritually religious and to not make gigantic tefillin that were showy and for outward display, but they're actually for instructing the heart, instructing the mind. The point of the tefillin is to remember something and not to be ostentatious. And so here, the actual text, and it shall be for a sign to thee upon thy hand and for a memorial between thy eyes, that the Lord's Torah may be in thy mouth, for with a strong hand did the Lord bring thee out of Mitzrayim. Thou shalt therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. But if you look at verse 8, it says, and thou shalt relate to thy son on that day, saying, this is done because of that which the Lord did to me when I came out of Mitzrayim. So the tefillin are part of the testimony. It's a traditional interpretation of how to observe, these passages, and remind the children. And so I just wanted to bring that up. Okay. And I also wanted to bring up that it's actually repeated twice in the same chapter, which means it's a pretty strong instruction. It said it in verse 9, but it also says it here in verse 16. And it shall be for a token upon thy hand and for frontlets between thy eyes, for by the strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Mitzrayim. And if you look above, it's saying again in verse 14, and it shall be when thy son asks thee in time comes saying, what is this? So it's all connected to training the children. And I I found that I was actually, after this Parsha, just my meditation, I saw everywhere I see the tefillin. And I did see, by the way, when I was down in Kfar Be'eri, and we were with a bunch of soldiers, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a Chabadnik with his scruffy little beard came out of nowhere, jumped out of his car, and had tefillin. And he was going to the soldiers, and he was trying to encourage the soldiers to put on the tefillin and to pray. And so I saw him there doing his righteous work. And so I asked him, I said, hey, can I chat with you? I'd just love to know where you live, where you're from. And, we just had a nice little conversation. And I saw, an active encouragement from a very devout individual who was trying to encourage soldiers to pray. And I think to remember these promises, and even I did, when I after reading this, I went to my friend who's in the army, and I said to him, I said, hey, I just want to let you know that, tefillin, when you put them on, this is what you're remembering, is that God brought you out of Egypt, and he's bringing you out of Egypt now. He's helping to, or arguably maybe push, evil out of your country as part of the same promise, the promise that you will enter the land of Canaan and you'll live there securely. And that's a God promise. And I enjoy doing that. So I've talked enough, and let's get to the questions. So first question: how can we all learn from these instructions to teach the young? I thought maybe we could meditate together about, what does that mean to us, and how can we apply that today? And for a lot of us, we live in a very secularized world where schools are run by secular people, and then we have our places of faith, with a synagogue or a church, and then we try to do the education in split ways. How can we move into the future? Because there are tensions there. There are things that are a little difficult that are happening in the world. I'm not going to get into details, but that's where we live. So can non-Jews also use the Exodus story to instruct their young about the God of Israel's intentions for the nations? I think that's an interesting question. For non-Jews who you can't take on somebody else's story and say, my ancestors, what happens if you're descended from Mitzrayim? You can't say that you read the Bible and say, well, my ancestors came out of Mitzrayim. No, you're on the other side of the story. So it's worthwhile thinking about, for those of us who are not Jews, who are not Jewish, but this story can really be something that we can use to train our young too, because there's something, I think, for everyone in the Exodus story. Okay, question 3: how does the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob want to distinguish in a positive way between Mitzrayim and Israel today? And I really think I would encourage you to try to think about that from the bridal paradigm, where the Kala, where it's talking about this bride came out of Mitzrayim, the Lord was sanctifying a nation unto himself, playing from the wedding vows under the chuppah, and that as nations, there's a role for us to play in participating in that process of preparing a bride for God. So with that, I think we can head off to the breakout rooms, and I would encourage you guys, find someone in the team who's not averse to taking notes, and when we get back together, we'll have some good thoughts, hopefully, to share with each other. So thank you. Well, we really started, Dina kind of threw the football to the Christians in the room, because she was curious about what we thought about this question about instructing the young. And then immediately Lisa jumped in and shared with us how she homeschooled 4 daughters, specifically because she felt that she needed to take responsibility to teach her children biblical values. And so she found a good curriculum, and then they started the day with reading the Bible, the scriptures, and then also doing musical worship together. And that was a good way that she could take the initiative to give her children some good teaching. Right after that, Phoebe shared with us that she was dealing with her grandchildren, and that she is a grandmother, obviously, and is driving her grandchildren to school. And so she's using that time when she takes her grandchildren, and she'll use the Bible, and then they'll choose a scripture, and they'll discuss the scripture together, and that she finds that that's a very effective way to help educate, the next generation. That kind of bounced back to Dina, who wanted to share that she likes to bring out the theme of slavery in these passages for the young to understand what that meant, and also to understand how radical the Bible was in that context, to challenge the status quo and to actually make it a sin, for example, to return slaves to their masters. And that was, was one of the big shocks to the system, I guess, of morality in the world when God gave Israel those instructions. Then Lisa jumped in right after that and shared that in the South, there were slave Bibles in the United States where they purposely removed sections from the Bible that talked about slavery. And that was just kind of like this incredible thing. And I thought when she was sharing that it's funny how everybody seems to like to create their own edited version of the Bible. You've probably heard of the Jeffersonian Bible, where he went through the Bible and he was a rationalist and he didn't believe in miracles. And so he literally edited the Bible and he took everything out of the Bible that was, in his estimation, miraculous. And then whatever text was left was left. So it's interesting that different people have edited the Bible for their own purposes, including Christians who didn't want to admit that the Jews were biblical Israel. So next, Tiffany shared with us, and she was sharing that as an African American, in her community, they're very in touch with the Exodus story, and they very much relate as a people group that had to come out of slavery to Moses and the people, and then even the songs and the hymns that the community used for many years are taken from the Exodus story, taken from Moses leaving Egypt. And also brought up Harriet Tubman, and that Harriet Tubman was seen as a Moses figure, leading African Americans, hundreds of them, into freedom. And that if God was a light to Israel, he was also a light to non-Jews who were in slavery in a parallel way. She brought that up. Yoav then shared with us, and he brought up how their family on Shabbat, they actually act out the Parshat reading, not every week, because sometimes the kids rebel, and that's okay, they're kids, right? But and at the same time, they can do plays, and he gave us an example of how they did plays with a bed sheet to show like the plague of darkness, so they couldn't see through the sheet, and that they also used all their little animal toys to represent the locusts coming in, and their little dolls for I guess the death of the firstborn. I'm not sure exactly how they did that action, but that's how I would do it. And then Jocelyn brought up, and I'll finish with this, that she wasn't raised with a biblical heritage, and she wasn't taught as a young person about Egypt and about the Israelites, and even about, as in a Christian way, she wasn't taught about Jesus or the New Testament or any of that stuff either. And that this kind of struck a chord, that she wasn't given an education as a young person. But that now, thank God, she is even now gaining instruction in the Bible, and we can all return to our youth in one way or another, right? And grow as adults in a kid-like fashion, in a positive way. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now. How about room 2? You have to unmute whoever's.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Good job.
Thanks. It's hard to do, to distill from all the amazing things that people say in these breakout groups, but I'll just bring a few of them to you. We started off by hearing 2 stories, one from me and one from Moshe. Moshe's experience teaching his grandchildren at the bar mitzvah of one of his grandsons, and us taking all of our grandchildren to Israel last March, that we take seriously this command to teach our children and our grandchildren the ways of the Lord in whatever way we can find to do it. And then we talked about the 3 different exoduses. So there was the one from Egypt, then there was one from Persia or Babylon. And in both cases, Cyrus, the Egyptians and Cyrus, gave Israel the material goods that they needed to reestablish themselves in the land. And the point that Yair was making was that it creates a model for all the nations, that when Israel goes home, we can all participate in helping Israel to have what she needs to be able to do that, and to be partners together with Israel. And Moshe brought up a recording of a song that he heard many, many times when he was young, because his father loved it. And it was a recording of the spiritual Let My People Go by Paul Robeson, who is a very famous Black singer and has a beautiful bass voice. And how this story of the Exodus doesn't only apply to Israel, but it's a meta-narrative, it's a paradigm of all people in the world, and it's against oppression and in favor of freedom. And then we talked a little bit about freedom. The whole idea of coming out of a view of the world that is human-centered into one that's God-centered, and the God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how that's a parallel to crossing the Red Sea and crossing the Jordan. And that this freedom involves coming from something to something else, and the something else is a responsibility to teach the children, to teach them the values that will allow them to maintain freedom for themselves, to maintain themselves as a free nation, such as kindness and discipline, and a desire not to oppress other people. And we also talked a little bit about emulating Israel by teaching the children from the scriptures, but not falling into the idea that we have replaced Israel, or we've become, or we are Israel, but rather we're the nations who are aligning ourselves with Israel. We have our own place, just as Israel has their own place. Okay, and our group was us and Moshe, Hadass, Yair, Paul, and David, and Sue, who had to leave.
Catherine too, she had to go, but
Catherine, yes.
I forgot we brought our kids to Israel too. That was part of homeschool studying.
Perfect.
Yeah. But I mean, I can't imagine doing that. Is like, I honor you doing that as grandparents. That's like I love generation to generation. That's it. That's captured. Like, if you can't live there because it's not, you're not
Yeah.
all doing it there. It's
And,
not.
and we were privileged. We were privileged. Thank you so much, Ruth and Rick. I wrote you on the chat. We were privileged to have a small part in meeting your wonderful family and seeing that in action.
Yes.
And I welcome everyone, you know. I mean, this war is not going to go on forever.
Do it. Take
Come
your
and
to Israel
spend the Shabbat together with us, and we'd love to get to know
have
your
a meal
extended
with
families
Dina.
and host you here in the land.
Yeah.
I think Dean is trying to get some of us to come. So watch out for it. After our conference, I had some time with Dean Bai, and we were talking about how do we heal this rift. And he has this wonderful teaching about the extending Rift Valley, starting from way up in the Mid-East and cutting specifically through East Africa, and the revelations that he got. So he's got something cooking in there, and he's going to get a few of us to come round into the Valley of Prayer there in the Jordan Valley sometime this year. So it's going to happen. We had bought our tickets.
You know, what's wonderful.
If you
had told me 15 years ago, you know, that I'd feel so warmly towards all of you as my family, that we'd be studying Bible together. And I think it's a small part, but it's a beginning, you know?
Yes.
I agree. And all of you get to be people who carry it out, you know, get to teach other people. I mean, I rub shoulders with people all the time trying to teach and to share some of the ways that we can come together here, you know. It's wonderful.
I wanted to say it's irrelevant, actually, I mean, to our conversation per se, but Gabriel brought up Thomas Jefferson in the Jefferson Bible, where he took out all and the fact that Jefferson was one of the key orchestrators of the French Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and that declaration has no mention of God in it whatsoever, and it became the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I find that to be
Excellent.
extremely interesting when you
That is-
connect it to what you just said. Yeah.
And you could say that that declaration actually has within it the roots of the secular communist movement.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Interesting. Interesting.
Very, very interesting.
Very good. Wow. Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for participating as much as you did today.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Gabriel.
Gabe.
Great.